Welcome to Lyra Echo Stories, where every story echoes emotions, memories, and hidden truths. Step in and feel the echo of every tale.
The Christmas tree was too small for the living room, and Daniel knew it and bought it anyway. He'd come home with it 3 Saturdays before, hauled it through the front door sideways, and set it up in the corner by the window, with the confidence of a man who had made an excellent decision. Maisie had immediately declared it perfect. I'd looked at the 6-inch gap between the top of the tree and the ceiling and thought, that's the one thing that fits exactly right in here. We were that kind of family. We made things work. By Christmas morning, the tree was draped in mismatched ornaments, the ones we'd collected from every place we'd visited, the ones Daniel's mother had sent in a shoebox after she downsized, the ones Maisie had made in school out of salt dough and an enthusiasm that outpaced her fine motor skills. The living room smelled like pine and the cardamom candle I lit every December, without being able to tell you why. I was in the kitchen when Maisie found me. She climbed onto the bar stool at the kitchen island and pulled the tray of Christmas cookies toward herself, the ones we'd baked the night before, waiting to be frosted with the focused expression she gets when she's decided something matters. She'd already laid out the frosting bags by color. Red, green, white. 1 toothpick for detail work. You need a toothpick? I asked. For the snowflakes. She didn't look up. The lines have to be thin. I watched her for a moment, this child of mine who approaches every small thing like it deserves her full attention, and thought about how strange it was that she was 9, and already knew that some things require a toothpick. Daniel came downstairs in his flannel shirt, the dark blue one that had gone soft at the elbows from years of washing, and poured himself a cup of coffee. He leaned against the counter and looked at me. Not at the cookies. Not at Maisie. At me. You sleep okay? He asked. Fine, I said, which was true, mostly. I'd been awake between 2 and 3, but that had been happening on and off for 6 weeks, ever since I'd opened that folder on my tablet for the first time and understood what I was looking at. You don't sleep perfectly when you're carrying something. You just sleep around it. The tablet was on the kitchen counter. I'd put it there the night before without thinking about it, the same way you set your keys somewhere and then can't explain why that particular spot. I looked at it, then I looked away. Then Maisie made a sound, a small, surprised oh, and I turned. One of the ornaments from the tree in the living room had rolled onto the hardwood floor. It must have fallen when Daniel came downstairs, some small vibration from his footsteps shaking it loose. It had landed near the kitchen doorway, rocking gently to a stop. It had broken. A clean split, right through the middle, a painted ceramic one, pale blue, with a thin gold ring around the top. Maisie had made it in 2nd grade. She'd spelled Mitchell on the back, because she'd run out of room for the L in Mitchell, and decided that was close enough. Maisie slid off the bar stool. She stood over it. Her face did the thing it does when she's deciding how to feel, a brief, still moment, eyes moving over something the way you read a sentence twice to make sure you understood it. She was trying not to let it ruin the morning. I sat down on the floor. Come here, I said. She sat beside me. I picked up both halves. The break was cleaner than I'd expected, a single line running diagonally through the ceramic. I went to the junk drawer for the craft glue we kept there, for reasons exactly like this. It's going to show, Maisie said. She wasn't complaining, just noting a fact. Yeah, I said, but it'll hold. I pressed the 2 halves together and held them steady. The glue was clear. You'd be able to see the line if you looked, a thin seam running through the blue, but the shape would be whole. Maisie watched my hands. Is it still the same ornament? She asked. Yeah, baby, it's still the same ornament. She thought about this. Okay, she said finally, and climbed back up to her cookies. I held the pieces together for another 30 seconds, then carefully set the ornament on the counter to dry. I'd hang it back on the tree before we left. I wasn't sure why it felt important to do that before we left, but it did. Daniel waited until Maisie was absorbed in her snowflake details before he came to stand beside me. You sure you don't want to say something today? His voice was low, not pressuring, just asking. The way he asks things, like he's handing you a door and making clear he's not going to push you through it, I'm sure. I dried my hands on the dish towel. I'm going to talk to them after, when Carol's gone. No reason to make this into a thing. It's already a thing, I know. But Maisie doesn't need to see it become a bigger thing. He was quiet for a moment. She's stronger than you think. I know she is. I folded the dish towel. Set it down. But this is still my call. He looked at me. That long, careful look he has. The one that means he has something else to say and is deciding whether it's his to say. Then, okay. That was it. Just okay. 16 years of marriage, and I still think that's the thing I love most about him. The way he knows when okay is enough. I went to the counter, picked up the tablet, opened it, scrolled to the folder, and looked at it for a moment, the screenshots organized by date, the 2 pages of handwritten notes photographed and saved. 6 weeks of work, not a weapon. I'd never thought of it that way, just the truth sorted, so I'd stop second-guessing myself in the middle of the night. I closed the app, put the tablet in my purse. Maisie fell asleep in the back seat, somewhere around the 3rd stoplight. She'd been awake since 6:30, too excited about Christmas to stay in bed, not too excited to crash the moment we were moving and the heater was on. I watched her in the side mirror for a moment. Her head tipped against the window, one hand still loosely wrapped around the strap of her backpack. She'd asked to bring her backpack because she'd packed 3 things she wanted to show Grandma and Grandpa. I hadn't asked what they were. She liked having things ready to present. Daniel drove. The roads were mostly empty, that particular Christmas morning quiet that settles over suburbs, when everyone who is going somewhere is already there. Bare oaks along the roadside, gray sky, the occasional house with lights still running along its eaves. She asleep? Daniel asked. Yeah, he nodded, kept his eyes on the road. Outside, a yard sign went by. Merry Christmas to all. Someone's inflatable snowman had tipped over in the night and was lying flat in the frost, arms spread, staring straight up at nothing. I looked at it as we passed. Something about it was very honest. We didn't talk for the rest of the drive. That was okay. Daniel and I had gotten good at knowing which silences needed filling and which ones were fine as they were. This one was fine. There was enough being carried without adding words to it. When we pulled onto my parents' street, I saw Carol's car already in the driveway. Of course it was. Carol was always there first. I put my hand on my purse, felt the shape of the tablet through the leather. Not a weapon. Just the truth, organized by date. I wasn't going to use it today, I told myself. I was going to talk to them after. In the side mirror, Maisie's eyes were open. She was looking out the window at the house, already awake, already watching. She hadn't made a sound, just opened her eyes somewhere along the way, and was looking at the world with that steady, quiet attention of hers. I hadn't seen her wake up. I didn't know how long she'd been watching. Carol had rearranged the furniture. Not dramatically, just the armchair moved 2 feet to the left, the side table angled differently, the throw blanket folded and placed over the arm of the couch in a way my mother never folds throw blankets. Small adjustments. The kind that say, I've been here long enough to improve things. My mother was in the kitchen following instructions. My father was in his chair by the window with the newspaper, which meant he'd claimed the one piece of the room Carol hadn't touched yet. There they are! Carol came around the corner with her arms open, already smiling. She hugged Daniel first. She always hugged Daniel first. Some territorial instinct I'd stopped trying to name, then pulled me in. She smelled like the perfume she'd worn since college, something cedar and clean. And she held on a beat longer than necessary. You look tired, she said when she let go, hands still on my shoulders, studying my face with the careful attention of someone who genuinely cares. Are you okay? Work's been rough? I'm great. I stepped back. Merry Christmas, Carol. Of course. Of course. Her hands dropped. I worry. You know me. I did know her. That was the problem. Maisie had already gone to find my father, which was her tradition. She made a straight line for him every time, as if the rest of the room didn't exist until she'd confirmed he was where she left him. I heard him put the newspaper down, heard his voice go warm in a way it rarely did for anyone else. I took off my coat, smiled at my mother, who had appeared in the kitchen doorway with a dish towel over her shoulder. Come help me, she said. I went. 6 weeks before Christmas, my mother had called on a Tuesday evening. I was unloading the dishwasher. Maisie was in her room. Daniel wasn't home yet. It was a normal call. She asked about Thanksgiving plans. I asked about her hip. She told me about the bird that had started coming to the feeder in the backyard. A sparrow, she thought. but maybe a finch. Then, the job is still going okay, right? Carol mentioned she'd heard something she said you didn't want anyone to know, so I didn't want to pry, but I just wanted to check. I set down the glass I was holding, carefully, on the counter. What did she hear? I asked. Just that things were stressful. That there might be some changes coming. A pause. You know you can tell us if something's happening. Nothing's happening, Mom. We're having our best quarter in 3 years. Oh. She sounded genuinely relieved, which meant she genuinely believed it. I'm glad. Carol was just worried. After I hung up, I stood at the kitchen counter for a long time. The dishwasher was still half full. The glass was still on the counter where I'd set it down. Carol had told my mother I might be losing my job, and she'd added the detail she didn't want anyone to know that made the lie airtight. Because now if I denied it, I was either telling the truth or I was saving face. I went to the junk drawer and found a pen. Pulled a grocery list off the notepad, wrote the date, what my mother had said, what Carol had supposedly heard. Then I called Diane. We met for coffee 4 days later, a Saturday morning, at the place on Elm Street with the bad parking and the good lattes. I didn't ask directly. I've known Diane for 11 years. Her husband Greg and Daniel had worked together briefly, orbited the same circles long enough that our families had ended up linked in the way families do, through enough shared dinners, and enough passed along information to know roughly what everyone is doing. I knew Greg and Carol's husband ran into each other occasionally. I knew Diane had a good memory and a low tolerance for pretense. I said, "Has Greg mentioned anything Carol said about me lately?" Diane wrapped both hands around her mug. Didn't answer right away. "Diane," he mentioned a group chat. She looked at me. "Family stuff. Carol, your parents." He saw something on her phone once she didn't know he was looking. The coffee shop was warm. Someone's kid was running between the tables in the back. A man near the window was on a work call, speaking quietly and urgently into his phone. "How long?" I asked. He didn't know exactly, but Renee, she paused. He said it seemed like it had been going on a while. I looked at the table. The wood grain ran in long, parallel lines, and I followed one of them with my eyes to the edge, then back again. When I looked up, I said, "Okay, what are you going to do?" "I'm going to pay attention," I said, "and I'm going to write things down." That night, I made the folder. Not a dramatic decision, just a practical one. The way you start keeping receipts when you realize you might need to make a return. I titled it nothing, just a folder, on the tablet Daniel had given me 2 birthdays ago, sitting on my nightstand. Over the next 5 weeks, I filled it. Not with everything, just the things I could verify the lie about my job, a confused question from my mother about Maisie's difficulties at school that I traced back to a conversation she'd had with Carol, a reference to Daniel and me being in a hard place that my father mentioned once, carefully, as if testing whether I'd confirm it. None of it had happened. All of it had been said. I didn't call Carol. I didn't ask my parents about the group chat. I just kept the folder, and I watched, and I waited. I'd had a plan. I'd thought it through. I knew exactly how I wanted this to go. What I hadn't planned for was a Tuesday in December, a phone ringing in my kitchen, a voice saying with complete, baffled certainty Maisie's having difficulties at school, and the sound of my own daughter, in the next room, going very still. The lie about Maisie was the one that changed things. Not because it was the worst, I wasn't sure yet which one was worst, and I'd stopped trying to rank them. But because Maisie had been in the next room when my mother said it, still in her coat, backpack half off her shoulder, reaching into the front pocket for something. I'd watched her hand go still. She hadn't turned around. I'd kept my voice even and told my mother she'd heard wrong, that Maisie was doing beautifully, that her teacher had sent an email just 2 weeks ago. My mother said, "Oh, of course, Carol probably just misunderstood." We talked for another 3 minutes about something else entirely. When I hung up, Maisie was in her room with the door closed. I knocked. She said she was fine. I believed her because I needed to, and because 9-year-olds say they're fine the same way their mothers do. I went back to the kitchen and found the email from Maisie's teacher on my phone, one of the most engaged students in class. A genuine pleasure, and took a screenshot. Added it to the folder. Wrote the date. That was week 4. By week 5, I had a system. Not elaborate. I'm not someone who builds elaborate systems, but I'd started paying attention to the specific shape of what Carol was doing. The way you start to see a pattern in something you'd been looking at sideways for years. Every lie had the same structure, a grain of something real, stretched and reframed. Renee mentioned work stress once at Easter Carol, turned it into a layoff rumor. Maisie had a rough week in October. Normal kid stuff. One bad day, Carol turned it into a developmental concern. Daniel and I had one bad month 2 winters ago. The kind every marriage has. The kind you get through and don't think about afterward. Carol had apparently been thinking about it ever since. She wasn't inventing from nothing. She was taking the small, true things and building rooms around them that didn't exist. I found 3 more messages fragments. Things my parents mentioned without realizing they were mentioning them. References to conversations they'd had with Carol that they assumed I knew about. I wrote them all down. By Christmas Eve, the folder had 11 items. A grocery list of the last 2.5 years. I'd been planning to show it to my parents after the holidays. Quiet, private, no audience. Give them time to process without Carol in the room. I didn't want a confrontation. I wanted a conversation. There's a difference. And I knew which one would actually work. I thought about it while I was wrapping presents Christmas Eve. I thought about it while Daniel was asleep, and I was lying on my side looking at the ceiling. I thought about it in the car on the way over, with Carol's car already in the driveway and Maisie still drowsy from the drive, and I told myself, after dinner, when she's gone. Inside, Carol was holding court in the kitchen doorway while my mother arranged things on the counter. She was telling a story about a restaurant she and Greg had tried in Charlotte, something about the service, something about the wine list, and my mother was nodding in the way she nods when she's listening to Carol, which is slightly differently from the way she nods when she's listening to anyone else. More toward her, more turned in. I noticed it the way I'd been noticing things for 5 weeks. Filed it. Went to help with the food. The table got set. The food got carried out. Carol produced the salad, an architectural achievement in mixed greens. Something dehydrated, something pickled. A dressing she'd started, she explained, on Thursday. She described each component with the patient focus of someone teaching a class. My father looked at it, looked at me. I kept my face entirely neutral, which took more effort than I'd like to admit. Daniel took a careful bite, chewed. Maisie leaned toward me and said very quietly, "Is this a salad or a project?" I pressed my lips together. "It's both," I said. "Eat a little." Carol was watching us from across the table, still smiling, still performing the particular warmth she'd always been good at. I looked back at her and thought, she's been doing this for 2.5 years and she's still smiling, which means she believes she's winning, which means she doesn't know I've been keeping score. The food was good. My mother had made the things she always made, the green beans with the almonds, the rolls from the recipe she'd been using since before I was born. My father had poured wine for everyone and sparkling cider for Maisie, and for a little while the table sounded like Christmas is supposed to sound. Silverware, low voices, Maisie asking my father something about the bird feeder, my father answering at length. I sat with my folder in my purse, and the knowledge that after dinner, when Carol's car left the driveway, I was going to change the shape of my family's next year, maybe longer. I sat with the weight of that. Not heavily, I'd had 5 weeks to get used to it. Just present. The way a stone in your shoe is present. You keep walking. You know it's there. My mother refilled my glass without being asked. She caught my eye when she did it. A small private look, and I thought, she knows something's off. She's been knowing for weeks. She just hasn't known what to do with it. Neither had I. Until now. My father started telling the fishing story around the time my mother brought out the second basket of rolls. It was the one about the trip to Lake Norman in 1987 with his college roommate. The one where they'd rented a boat from a man who turned out not to own the boat and spent 4 hours on the water before the actual owner showed up in a second boat. And there'd been what my father called a spirited exchange. It was a good story. It had always been a good story. He'd been telling it for 37 years with the delivery of a man who has refined something carefully over time, and everyone at the table laughed at the right moments, because we knew where the right moments were. Maisie looked around the table. Looked at my father. "How many times have you told this one?" she asked. My father didn't miss a beat. First time, my mother, without looking up from her plate. 24th. My father looked at her. Looked at Maisie. Considered this. The 24th telling, he said, is the best one. Maisie weighed this with the seriousness she brings to most things. How come? Because by now I know which parts actually happened. I laughed. An actual laugh. The kind that comes up before you decide to have it. Daniel caught my eye across the table and smiled, not at the joke, just at me, the way he does when something small goes right. Carol was smiling too, but hers was the smile of someone waiting for their turn. She'd been doing it all through dinner, that particular patience of hers, letting the conversation run its course before she redirected it. I'd watched her do it my whole life without being able to name it. Now I could name it. I just hadn't said it out loud to anyone except Daniel and Diane. Renee. Her voice was easy, conversational, no edge in it at all. How's the commute been this winter? I know you've had a long drive. It's fine, 20 minutes. Right. But in the dark? In the cold? She shook her head sympathetically. I always think about how much of your day that takes. You work so hard. I don't mind the drive. No, I know. She speared a green bean. I just think about the balance. Everything you're juggling. Work, Maisie's schedule, the house. She glanced at my mother. It's a lot. My mother nodded. A small automatic nod. The kind you give when you've heard something enough times to have incorporated it into your understanding of the world. I picked up my water glass. Set it back down. There was a version of me that would have said, "What exactly do you think I'm juggling, Carol? What's the part you think I'm not managing? Let's be specific." I didn't say it. I had a plan, and the plan was after dinner, and I was keeping the plan. It balances fine, I said. Maisie, do you want more rolls? Maisie did want more rolls. The conversation moved on. Carol led it, because she didn't need to push, she just needed to plant. And she'd been planting for 2.5 years, and she knew by now that the soil was prepared. I excused myself to refill the water pitcher. It didn't need refilling. I just needed 60 seconds in a room by myself. The kitchen was quiet in the way kitchens get when dinner is already on the table, and everyone is elsewhere. A pan soaking in the sink, the overhead light humming very faintly. Through the doorway I could hear my father saying something, and Carol laughing, and Maisie asking Daniel a question in her careful way. I stood at the counter and looked at my hands. I'd been holding the plan for 5 weeks like something fragile, carrying it carefully, making sure I didn't jostle it. After dinner. Private. No audience. The version where everyone had room to process and nobody had to perform their reaction for a room full of people. It was a good plan. I still thought it was a good plan. What I hadn't accounted for was how long the dinner would feel. How much space Carol took up in a room just by being Carol, the laugh, the redirect, the careful tending of her position at the center of things. I'd been watching it for 5 weeks from a distance, and sitting across from it at a dinner table was something different. It had a weight to it. The way a thing always has more weight up close. From the dining room, Carol said something that made my mother laugh. My mother's laugh warm, a little surprised. The one she used when someone said something she genuinely found funny. I thought, how many times in the last 2 years has my mother laughed like that because of something Carol said about me? How many conversations had there been? Easy and warm, built on the foundation of things that hadn't happened. I filled the pitcher, went back to the table. Maisie had moved on to asking my father about the bird feeder, whether sparrows and finches could live in the same neighborhood, or whether they had preferences about it. My father was explaining the concept of territory with the focus of someone who had been waiting all dinner for a question he actually wanted to answer. Carol was watching Maisie with an expression I couldn't entirely read. Something careful in it, something that might have been genuine fondness and might have been something else, and I had stopped being able to tell the difference. I sat down, poured water for Daniel without asking. He thanked me quietly. The dinner table held all 6 of us, and Christmas was happening the way Christmas happens, imperfectly, loudly in some moments, too quiet in others. Nobody saying the things they were actually thinking. Exactly like every Christmas before this one. Except that this time I knew what was in my purse, and I was running out of reasons to wait until later. It happened the way these things always happen, not all at once, but in increments. each one small enough to dismiss on its own. Carol asked about Maisie's school as my mother was clearing the first round of plates. Casual, between reaching for a dish and saying something to my father about dessert. She's adjusting okay this year? I know last year was hard. Maisie looked up. She hadn't had a hard year last year. She's great, I said. Her teacher wrote to us 2 weeks ago. Oh, that's good. Carol stacked 2 plates together with the efficiency of someone who's made herself at home in this kitchen for years. I'd heard there were some concerns. I didn't want to say anything, but she glanced at my mother. We'd been a little worried. She and my mother, a unit, a conversation that had happened without me. There are no concerns, I said. There never were. Carol set the plates down and gave me the look sympathetic, patient, the look she'd perfected over 42 years of being my older sister. Renee, you don't have to… Carol. My father's voice, from the end of the table. He'd put his fork down. Let it go. She did. For about 4 minutes. Then the table was quieter, the way it gets when the main food is gone and people are deciding whether to have dessert. And Carol said not loudly, almost gently, I just think sometimes you make things harder than they need to be. You always have. You push people away and then wonder why there's distance. I put my fork down. I'm not trying to start anything. She held up one hand, the reasonable gesture. I'm saying it from a place of caring. Mom and Dad see it too. We all do. We love you. We want things to be good for you. But you make it, she paused, choosing the word difficult. The table had gone still. Daniel's hand moved under the table and found my knee. I thought, 5 more minutes. Clear the plates, get Maisie her dessert, wait until Carol's car is gone. 5 more minutes. 18 months ago, at a barbecue at my parents' house, Greg had stood near the back fence, watching Maisie teach my father a clapping game she'd invented. Carol had been beside him. I'd been on the other side of the yard, not paying attention. I'd found out later, through a chain of small conversations that took weeks to piece together, what Greg had said, that he'd watched Maisie for a moment, then looked over at me and said, to no one in particular, your sister has something. She just makes you want to pay attention to her. He'd meant it the way people mean that kind of thing. An observation, a small compliment about someone he saw twice a year. Carol had sent the first real lie that night. Not a reframing, not a grain of truth stretched thin. A fabrication. I'm worried about Renee and Daniel. Things aren't good between them. Please don't say I told you. I didn't know that then. I know it now. They love me more. Carol's voice had changed, not louder, but stripped of the warmth she usually kept in it, the insulation she wrapped every sharp thing in. They always have. You were never enough, Renee. Not for them. Not the way you'd need to be. The room went somewhere I don't have a word for. My mother made a sound. Not a word, just a sound. The beginning of something she didn't finish. My father had gone very still in his chair. Daniel's hand tightened on my knee once, then released. I looked at Carol across the table. She was looking back at me, and in her face, I could see both things at once, the absolute certainty of someone who believes they're finally saying a true thing, and underneath it, just barely, something that looked like fear, like she'd been holding this for a long time, and letting it go felt less like relief, and more like falling. She'd spent 2.5 years making sure my parents saw me a certain way, and then she'd said the things she'd been carrying that made her need to. Maisie was sitting very still beside her. I saw her look at the table in front of Carol. The phone was there face up, screen lit from a new message. Maisie's eyes moved across it. She read something. I watched her face change, the way water changes when you drop something into it, a disturbance moving outward from a center. She looked at me. Then she picked up the phone. Should I read it out loud? Nobody moved. Maisie was holding Carol's phone with both hands, the way she holds things she knows are important, and looking at me with an expression I'd never seen on her face before. Not fear, not excitement. Something older than both of those, the look of someone who has been waiting for the right moment and believes, correctly or not, that it has arrived. I stood up. Not fast, not dramatically. I pushed my chair back and stood the way you stand when you've made a decision, when the deciding is already done and what's left is just the doing. I walked around to Maisie's side of the table and put my hand on her shoulder. Give me that, baby, I said. She handed it over without hesitation. I looked at the screen for 1 second, enough to see the thread, to confirm what I already knew was there, and then I set Carol's phone down on the table in front of her, face down. I didn't need it. I'd never needed it. I went back to my chair, picked up my purse, and took out the tablet. Carol said my name. I didn't answer. I sat down, opened the tablet, and found the folder, the one with no title, the one I'd been building for 5 weeks, the one I'd been carrying into this house like a stone in my shoe for the last 4 hours. I wasn't planning to do this tonight, I said. I looked up from the screen and around the table. My father had both hands flat on the tablecloth. My mother had gone very still. The way she goes still when something is happening that she can't redirect into something easier. Daniel was watching me from across the table with his hands in his lap and an expression that said, "I'm here. This is yours. Take it." But I've been planning to do it. I opened the first message. September 14th. I kept my voice the same register it had been all dinner, not hard, not angry, just clear. Carol sent this to the family group chat, the one I'm not in. I read it the way you read something aloud when you want the words to land on their own without editorial. Just wanted to give you both a heads up. I've heard Renee might be let go from work. She didn't want anyone to know, so please don't say anything, but I thought you should be aware in case she needs support. The table was silent. Our company's third quarter numbers came out that week. Best quarter in 3 years. I'd been told I was being considered for senior manager. I scrolled. November 2nd. I found the second one. I don't want to alarm you, but things between Renee and Daniel haven't been good for a while. I've heard some things. I just think we should be there for her when it comes to a head. I set the tablet down. Looked at Daniel. He was already looking at me. He turned to my mother, unhurried, and said, 16 years this March. That was all. He didn't say it to Carol. He didn't raise his voice. He just said it to my mother. The way you state a fact that requires no elaboration, and then he turned back to me and waited. My mother's hand was on the table. She was looking at Daniel, then at me, then at something just past my shoulder. The way people look when they're doing rapid and painful arithmetic. One more, I said. I found it. I'm a little worried about Maisie. Her teacher reached out to me about some behavioral concerns. Renee doesn't seem to know. I didn't want to overstep, but thought you should be aware. Maisie was sitting very quietly beside Carol's empty spot. Carol had half risen at some point. I'd noticed it without looking directly at it. That small preparatory movement of someone who hasn't decided yet whether to leave or stay. She was still at the table. Her teacher's email from 2 weeks ago is also in here, I said. If anyone wants to read it. Nobody spoke. I have 11 items total. I closed the tablet. I don't need to go through all of them. The silence was the kind that has texture. I could hear the refrigerator from the kitchen, a low, continuous hum. The candle on the sideboard had burned down past the halfway mark. Carol said, "You're making this into something it isn't." I waited. I was worried about you. All of it came from a place of, I was genuinely worried, Renee. And you're sitting here treating it like some kind of Carol. My father's voice. Flat, quiet, the voice he used maybe 3 times a year. The one that meant the conversation had reached the place where he was done listening. She looked at him. "Don't," he said. She looked at him for a moment longer. And something moved through her face. Something I recognized. Some internal recalculation. Some part of her that had been running a version of this conversation in her head and was now realizing the actual version wasn't going the same way. She turned back to me. "You've never," she started. Then stopped. Then started again. And what came out wasn't the careful, managed thing she'd been producing all night. It was something raw, something that had been behind the careful thing the whole time. "You left. You built your little life, and you left. And I stayed. I've been here. I've been the one who shows up, who takes care of things, who makes sure they're not alone. And you come back for Christmas, and everyone acts like," her voice had gone uneven, something brittle coming into it, like you're the one they were waiting for. Like I've been holding this family together for years, and you walk in and suddenly, Carol, my father again. She stopped. Her chest was moving. Her hands were on the table. My father looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face that I hadn't seen before. Not anger, not disappointment exactly. Something sadder and more permanent than either. "You should go home," he said. 3 words. The same register he'd used to say don't. Not a punishment. Not a declaration. Just a fact about what needed to happen next. Carol looked at my mother. My mother was looking at her hands. She didn't look up. Carol took her napkin from her lap and folded it in a way that had no practical purpose. She stood, found her coat on the hook by the door, and left. The door didn't slam. It closed with the latch click of a door being pulled carefully shut, which was somehow worse. The 6 of us became 5. No one said anything for a moment. The candle on the sideboard went on burning. Outside, through the window, headlights swept across the ceiling as Carol's car backed out of the driveway. My mother put her hand over her mouth. Then she lowered it. Then she said very quietly, "I called her boss 2 months ago. After you told me nothing was wrong with the job, he said you were. He said you were the best project manager they'd ever had in that role." I looked at her. "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because I didn't know what to say." She looked at me the way she hadn't looked at me in a long time, directly, without the intermediary of Carol's version of who I was. I'd forgotten that my mother's eyes were this particular shade of brown, that they creased in this particular way when she was trying not to cry. I didn't know what to say either, I told her, so I wrote it down. My father stood up from his chair. He walked around the table slowly, the walk of a man in his late 60s, who has said something hard and is now doing the quieter thing, the thing that doesn't require more words. He put his hand on my shoulder and stood there for a moment, not saying anything, just standing there, and I understood that this was the most he'd been able to give across the expanse of what had just happened, and that it was enough. Maisie, who had been sitting very still through all of it, looked around the table at the 4 of us. Then she looked at the kitchen. "Can we have the pie now?" she asked. My father made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh but was adjacent to one. My mother, to her own visible surprise, laughed a short, broken sound, but real. Daniel stood up to go get dessert. I looked at my daughter, 9 years old, sitting straight in her chair, entirely serious. "Yeah, baby," I said. "We can have the pie." Daniel brought out the pie, and then did a thing I'd seen him do before, in situations that had outgrown themselves. He quietly reorganized the room. Not obviously. He just suggested, with the calm of someone who knows how to move people without making them feel moved, that Maisie might want to show her grandfather the things she'd packed in her backpack. My father, who understood this kind of suggestion when he heard it, said he'd been waiting all evening to find out what was in there. Maisie got her backpack. The 2 of them settled into the living room, and Daniel disappeared back into the kitchen, and the dining room table became smaller in a way that had nothing to do with the number of chairs. My mother and I sat across from each other with our pie. She'd made apple, like she used to. She hadn't made apple in years. Carol always brought the lemon tart, and it was understood, without discussion, that you didn't bring 2 desserts to the same occasion. So my mother had stopped making the apple. I hadn't thought about it until now, sitting across from her with a slice of something she'd quietly given up and then quietly taken back. She wasn't eating. She was looking at her plate with the attention of someone who has several things to say and is deciding which one goes first. "I knew something was wrong," she said. "I want you to know that. Not what it was, I didn't know what it was. But I knew." "When?" She thought about it honestly, which I appreciated. 6 months ago. Maybe 7. There was a she stopped. "She told us you'd missed Maisie's school concert. Because of work. And I mentioned it to your father, and he said he didn't remember you being the kind of person who missed things like that." And I said, "People change." And he looked at me. She paused. He looked at me the way Frank looks at me when I'm saying something I don't actually believe. My father, from the living room, said something that made Maisie laugh. A clear, uncomplicated sound. "I should have called you," my mother said. "I kept thinking I would. And then I'd talk to Carol and she'd have another explanation. And it was she stopped again. It was easier to have an explanation, even one that didn't fully make sense." I looked at her. She looked back. We were having, for the first time in a long time, a conversation that was only between the 2 of us, without Carol's version of things sitting at the table like a third person. "I owe you an apology," she said. "Mom, I do." She said it quietly, but without room for argument. Not for not knowing, for not asking. There's a difference, and I know the difference, and I chose the one that was easier. "I'm sorry." I'd spent 5 weeks imagining this conversation in various forms. In the car on the way to the grocery store, in the shower, in the 20 minutes between when I woke up at 2 in the morning and when I finally fell back asleep. In most of the versions, I was calm and clear and said exactly the right thing. In some of them, I cried. I didn't cry now. I just looked at my mother and felt the particular texture of something that has been wrong for a long time, beginning to be right, not fixed, not healed, but reoriented, like a compass needle that's been pulled off north for so long you've forgotten which direction you were supposed to be going, and then suddenly it swings back. I have something to say too, I said. She waited. I knew about the group chat 6 weeks ago. I've had the folder since then. I looked at the table. My plan was to talk to you and Dad privately, after the holidays. Give you time to process it without Carol in the room, without it becoming a whole thing. I paused. I was trying to be strategic about it, and I think it was partly that, and partly that I was still waiting for you to see it on your own, without me having to show you. René, I'm not saying it to make you feel worse. I'm saying it because it's true. I stayed silent for 6 weeks after I knew, because somewhere in me I still needed it to be something you came to yourself. That was my mistake. It wasn't the only one I made. My mother set down her fork. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine, her hand dry and warm. The particular warmth of it, familiar in a way that went further back than memory. You were 11 years old, she said. The first time you apologized to me for something that was Carol's fault. You'd been fighting in the car on the way to your grandmother's house. Carol had started it. You both got in trouble, and afterward you came and found me and said, "I'm sorry. I should have just ignored her." She looked at me. You were 11. I didn't know what to say to that. So, I didn't say anything. You've been apologizing for things that weren't yours since before you knew how to stop, she said. I'm not going to sit here and let you apologize for not fixing this faster. From the living room, my father's voice. No, this one goes here. See how the colors match? Your grandmother picked that one out. Maisie, how do you remember that? She told me every year. My mother and I sat in the quiet of that, listening to my father show my daughter a Christmas ornament and explain where it had come from. I thought about the ornament Maisie had broken that morning, the one I'd fixed with clear glue, the one I'd hung back on the tree before we left. Still whole, still with the line through it where it had cracked, the repair visible if you looked. What happens now? My mother asked. With Carol? I don't know, I said. And then, because it was true, I don't need to know yet. That's between you and her and Greg. It doesn't have to be decided tonight. She nodded slowly. She's in pain, she said. I don't say that to excuse anything. I know she is, I said. I figured that out a while ago. It doesn't change what she did, but I know. My mother looked at me for a long moment with the expression of someone who has just understood something about their child that they wish they'd understood sooner. Daniel appeared from the kitchen. I made decaf, he said. He looked at the pot he was carrying present. He means it's bad, I said. I mean it's present in the room. Whether it's good is a separate question. My father walked back in from the living room with Maisie behind him, her backpack now open, and 3 of its 4 treasures already displayed. A drawing she'd made of the house on Elm Street where my parents used to live. A small, smooth rock she'd found at the state park in October and decided was too interesting to put down. And a photograph she'd printed herself, on the printer in our office, of the 4 of us at the beach last August. She hadn't yet shown him the 4th thing. She was saving it. We sat in the living room and drank Daniel's decaf, which was, in fact, bad too weak, slightly oversteeped, in the mugs my parents had been using since the mid-90s. My father held his cup and looked into it with the expression of a man who has decided, wisely, not to say anything. My mother topped hers off with hot water from the kettle, which did not improve it. Maisie didn't drink coffee, so she had the rest of her cider, and she sat on the floor near my father's chair and eventually showed him the 4th thing she'd packed. A drawing of him done in colored pencil, labeled Grandpa in the careful block letters of someone who has been practicing. My father held it for a long time, longer than seemed strictly necessary for looking at a drawing. This is very good, he said. I practiced, Maisie said. I can tell, he said, and his voice was just slightly different than it had been all evening, and he didn't say anything else, and nobody needed him to. I sat on the couch between my mother and Daniel. The Christmas tree in the corner put colored light across the ceiling. Outside, it had gotten fully dark, and the neighborhood was quiet the way it gets on Christmas evening, when the morning has been spent and everyone is home. I thought about Carol's car backing out of the driveway, the careful click of the door. I thought about the folder, still on my tablet, still in my purse. 11 items. I'd spent 5 weeks building something I'd hoped I would never need, and had brought it into this house like a key for a door I hoped was already open. The door had been closed. Now it wasn't. That was enough for tonight. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday in January, my parents came for dinner. Not Sunday, not a holiday. A Tuesday, which was the whole point. A Tuesday meant it wasn't an occasion, wasn't anything that required preparing for or bracing against. It was just dinner. I'd called my mother on Thursday and said, "Come Tuesday, Daniel's making his chicken thing." And she'd said okay, and that was the entire negotiation. Daniel had been cooking since 4. He had the radio on low, something instrumental, and he'd sent me out of the kitchen twice already for offering to help, on the grounds that helping was not the job tonight. My job, he said, was to sit in the living room and not look stressed about anything. I was sitting in the living room not looking stressed about anything. Maisie was setting the table. She'd asked if she could do it herself, and I'd said yes, and she was now engaged in a project that involved getting the angles of the forks exactly right. She'd learned recently, from somewhere, that there was a correct way to set a table, and she was applying this knowledge with the thoroughness she brought to most things. "Is Grandpa going to like the chicken thing?" she asked. "Grandpa likes most things," I said. "He didn't like the salad at Christmas." "Nobody liked the salad at Christmas." She considered this, straightening a knife. "I thought it was interesting," she said diplomatically, and I thought, this child is going to be fine. Whatever else, she is going to be completely fine. My parents arrived at 6:15. My father was carrying a bottle of wine, a Malbec from the grocery store, the kind he always bought, $12, reliable. My mother was carrying a pie, apple. She held it out to me at the door with the air of someone completing a long overdue task. "I made apple," she said. "I know," I said. "You told me on the phone." I wanted to say it again in person. I took it from her and hugged her with my free arm, and she held on for a moment longer than the usual quick hello, and I let her. My father came in behind her and handed Daniel the wine, and said he hoped the kitchen wasn't too crowded, which was my father's way of asking if he could stand in the kitchen and watch Daniel cook, which was a thing he liked to do and never asked directly. Daniel said there was plenty of room. My father went to stand in the kitchen. Maisie, table now set to her satisfaction, appeared and took my mother by the hand toward the living room to show her something I didn't hear what, just the beginning of Maisie's explanation, which involved the rock from the state park and some context about igneous versus sedimentary that she'd been reading about. My mother said she'd always wanted to know more about rocks. This was not true, but she said it with complete sincerity, which is its own kind of truth. I stood in the front hall for a moment with the apple pie in my hands. The house smelled like garlic and rosemary from Daniel's chicken, and outside the January dark had come in early, and through the kitchen doorway I could hear my father asking Daniel a question about the pan he was using, and from the living room I could hear Maisie explaining the difference between 2 types of rock formation, and it was a Tuesday. Just a Tuesday. After dinner, after the pie, which was better than the decaf, which was not a high bar, but still my father wandered toward the small Christmas tree we hadn't taken down yet. We usually kept it up until after New Year's, and then took our time getting around to it, and it was still standing in the corner with the lights on low, the way we left it in the evenings. He was looking at the ornaments the way he'd looked at Maisie's drawing at Christmas, that slow, careful attention he had when something had reached him and he was taking his time with it. Then he found the pale blue one, the ceramic one, the one Maisie had made in 2nd grade, the one that had fallen and broken Christmas morning while we were still at home. He took it off the branch gently, the way you handle things that have history, and held it up toward the lamp. The line was still there. You could see it clearly in the right light, a thin diagonal seam running through the glue holding it clean and invisible except for the interruption in the surface. He turned it over, read Mitzel on the back. "Maisie made this," he said. It wasn't a question. 2nd grade, I said. She ran out of room for the last letter. He held it a moment longer, then he put it back on the branch, gently, in the same spot he'd taken it from. "Still good," he said. "Yeah," I said. "Still good." He put his hands in his pockets and looked at the tree for another moment, and I looked at him, and neither of us said the other thing, the thing that was also there, that we were both aware of, about broken things and clear glue and whether the repair shows. We didn't need to say it. It was in the room with us, either way. We went back to the table for more decaf. Daniel had made it again, and it was still not good, and my father looked at it with the resigned expression of a man who has decided this is the hill he will not die on. My mother said, quietly, while Maisie was in the kitchen getting the last of the pie, Carol called this week. I wrapped my hands around my mug. Okay, I haven't decided what I want to say to her yet. She looked at me. I wanted you to know that I'm taking my time with it. That's yours to figure out, I said. I mean that. I know you do. She was quiet for a moment. She's my daughter. I don't know how to, she stopped. I don't know yet. You don't have to know yet, I said. She nodded. Maisie came back with the pie. The conversation moved to other things. Later, after they'd gone, after Maisie was in bed and Daniel was finishing the dishes, I stood in the kitchen by myself. Same kitchen. Same counter where the tablet had been sitting 3 weeks ago, where I'd picked it up and looked at the folder and put it in my purse. The counter was empty now. The tablet was in the drawer beside the junk drawer, where we kept things we didn't need every day. I hadn't opened the folder since Christmas. I stood there in the quiet of the kitchen and thought about the thing I'd told my mother at the table, that I'd stayed silent because I'd been waiting for her to see it on her own. That had been true, but there was a layer underneath it I hadn't said, that I was still working out for myself. For 2.5 years, Carol had been rewriting me, taking the small, true things, the hard months, the tired seasons, the ordinary difficulties of a life being lived, and building false rooms around them. And I had let it go on longer than I should have, because some part of me, some part I hadn't examined directly, had thought, maybe she's right. Maybe this is what happens to people like me. Maybe the gap between who I am and who I'm supposed to be is real, and Carol just found a way to make everyone else see it. That was the part that had needed the folder. Not to prove anything to my parents, to prove something to myself. The folder was not a weapon I'd aimed at Carol. It was evidence I'd gathered against the version of myself I was afraid of becoming, the one who believed that if enough people said something, it must be true. Carol had spent 2.5 years rewriting me, but you can only rewrite someone who isn't sure of the original. I was sure of the original. I turned off the kitchen light. Outside, the January dark was full and still, the neighborhood quiet the way it gets on a weeknight when everyone has gone inside and the world has settled into itself. Through the window, one house down, someone had left their porch light on a small yellow point, in all that dark, not dramatic, just present. I stood there for a moment and looked at it. For a long time, the dark had felt like a place where things were hiding, where the versions of me Carol had sent into the world were living, taking up residence in the spaces I couldn't see. It didn't feel like that now. It just felt like night. If someone has spent years quietly reshaping how the people around you see you, planting small doubts, reframing your struggles, speaking with concern that was never really concern, you may have spent just as many years wondering what you did to deserve it. That's the cruelest part of that kind of betrayal. It turns you into the investigator of your own character, sifting through your choices and your failures, looking for the thing that made you deserve it. Most of the time, there's nothing there to find. Because the people who work hardest to diminish you are almost never responding to your failures. They're responding to something in you that they can't match: your steadiness, your warmth, the way you hold things together without needing a room to notice. That threatens them in a way they can't name. So they translate it into a story where your strengths become your flaws and your ordinary hard days become evidence of collapse. The story isn't about you. It never was. It was always about what they couldn't stand to see you have. What Renee had to learn, and what takes most of us far longer than we'd like, is that staying silent while you wait for the right moment isn't the same as being patient. Sometimes it's a way of still asking for permission. Permission to be believed. Permission to take up space. Permission to say, this happened, and it wasn't okay. You don't need that permission. The truth doesn't require a perfect moment or an airtight case or a room full of witnesses. It just requires you to stop waiting for someone else to arrive at it on their own. And here's what's worth holding on to. The folder Renee built wasn't really for her parents. It was for herself. It was the accumulation of proof that what she knew was real, that her instincts were right, that the version of her carol had been circulating was not the original. Sometimes that's what self-trust looks like, not a feeling, but a document. Not certainty, but a record. You gather the evidence and you carry it until you're ready. And when the moment comes, you're already there. Have you ever had someone close to you quietly rewrite who you are to the people you love? Have you ever waited too long for a moment that felt safe enough to tell the truth? And when you finally did, what changed? We'd love to hear your story in the comments.
Thank you for being part of Lyra Echo Stories. If this story stayed with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, because every echo never truly fades.